For decades, the tragic story of Princess Diana has been surrounded by mystery, whispers, and unanswered questions. But now, someone who was closer to her than most is breaking his silence. Her private pilot, the man who flew her across continents and witnessed moments hidden from the...
You couldn't forget it. When we got airborne from Villa Coublay in Paris with the coffin in the hole...
hidden from the public eye, is finally revealing the harsh truth. What really happened behind closed doors? Why was she so afraid in her final days? This isn't royal gossip. This is a shocking confession that could change everything we thought we knew. A pilot's heartbreaking mission. Graham Laurie spent more than 2 decades soaring across continents with the British royal family, clocking over 2,000 flights that included nearly 100 with the Queen herself. But no flight, no matter how routine or royal, could have prepared him for the emotionally crushing journey on August 31, 1997, the day he was called upon to fly Princess Diana's body home from Paris, just hours after her tragic death. Laurie, a seasoned pilot who had flown Princess Diana since her 20s, was suddenly thrust into a mission of staggering, emotional weight. The call came unexpectedly, with just 8 hours to prepare. Plans had originally outlined that the princess's body would return on the 4th day following her death. But in a whirlwind of activity and changing logistics, that plan was torn up, and the flight was fast-tracked. Engineers rushed to refit the aircraft, even changing it entirely to better suit the sensitive nature of the task ahead. As they lifted off from Villa Coublay Air Base in Paris, the silence in the cockpit was profound. The coffin, carefully placed in the aircraft's hold, carried not only the body of the Princess of Wales but also the collective sorrow of a grieving world. Air traffic controllers across Europe, hardened professionals used to brisk and efficient communication, softened their voices as they radioed in their condolences. Each one, without exception, asked the crew to pass on their heartfelt sympathies to Prince Charles. It was a rare moment of shared grief in the skies. The flight was meticulously timed. They aimed to arrive at Royal Air Force Northolt at 7 p.m., a precision landing that required expert coordination. And yet, for all the technical mastery, the emotional toll was heavier than any cargo Graham Laurie had ever carried.
The actual grief came later, I think, but you couldn't forget it.
The shock was overwhelming, he later said. The grief came later, but that moment, the reality of it, it hit like a wave. The golden sunset that painted the sky as the plane departed Paris would forever be etched in Laurie's memory. It wasn't just the light, it was the symbolism. A once radiant life, now dimmed too soon. But Graham's connection to Diana wasn't just professional, it was deeply human. He remembered the lighter days, flying with her and the young princes. Prince William, just a toddler at the time, was once allowed to lower the landing gear, a thrilling moment for a child enchanted by the cockpit's buttons and dials. But soon, the cockpit visits had to stop. 2 playful children exploring a pilot's domain was charming, but risky. Still, those memories remained close to Graham's heart, reminders of Diana's warmth and her love for her boys. Just 2 days after returning from that fateful flight, Laurie was summoned to Highgrove. Prince Charles had heard about the overwhelming media attention surrounding the crew, and his first question, spoken with quiet concern, was simple. How are your wife and family coping with all of this? It was a moment that revealed the prince's character. Laurie, who had taken full responsibility for the incident that attracted press attention, remembered the gesture with quiet admiration. It says a lot about the man he is, he said. Even in the aftermath of such a haunting flight, Graham joined mourners like everyone else. At St. James's Palace, he stood in line, anonymous among the crowd, to sign Diana's book of condolence. The grief was not reserved for the public. For those who knew her, who had flown beside her, laughed with her children, and now carried her home, the loss was deeply personal. And while the world moved forward, the memories of sunsets, of laughter in the cockpit, of a princess gone too soon, still soared with him. But what did Diana's pilot witness before the crash that still echoes in silence? Keep watching. There's more than meets the eye. What Diana's pilot knew before the crash. Even after signing the Book of Condolence at St. James's Palace, Squadron Leader Graham Laurie couldn't shake the memories, ones that weren't about aircraft or flight plans, but the quiet, often overlooked moments that hinted at something deeper. Diana wasn't just a passenger. He flew. She was a presence. And in the final months of her life, that presence had changed. Something was different. By the summer of 1997, the whirlwind around Diana had only grown fiercer. On the outside, it looked like she was embracing freedom. 10 days of sun-drenched escape on Mohammed Al Fayed's luxury yacht off the coast of Sardinia. Flashes of her smiling with Dodi Fayed. Photos snapped from dizzying distances, some taken with military-grade lenses. To the public, it seemed like Diana had found a new chapter. But Graham had seen another side, years earlier, one that hinted this was more than a glamorous romance. She always seemed like she was searching, he later said in hushed reflection. When Diana arrived in Paris on August 30th, 1997, her plan was to fly back to London the next day. She was set to reunite with William and Harry after their summer holiday. That maternal pull never left her, no matter how chaotic the world around her became. And while the media speculated about her love life, Diana's pilot remembered her softer concerns: the safety of her boys, the constant intrusion, the fear of never having a moment to herself. That night in Paris, the original plan was simple: dinner out, a quiet evening. But it became anything but. As Graham had long feared, the media frenzy would eventually push too far. After deciding to avoid the public chaos, Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz, ironically owned by his family. By midnight, they'd opted to return to Dodi's nearby apartment, but instead of leaving through the main entrance, they slipped out the back, using a decoy car to distract the swarming paparazzi. What happened next would be analyzed for decades. Their car, driven by Henri Paul, the Ritz's deputy head of security, raced toward the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. They were trying to outrun flashing bulbs and shouting voices. In the cockpit, pilots like Graham weren't trained for these horrors. But when he later learned of the accident, of Henri Paul's intoxication, of the high speed, his heart sank. It wasn't just an accident, he would later say. It was a buildup, years in the making, and anyone who knew her knew this might come. Henri Paul and Dodi died instantly. Diana, found conscious in the wreckage, would be rushed to the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital. Despite surgeons' efforts, she was pronounced dead at 4 a.m. on August 31st. She was just 36 years old.
We have reports from Paris that Diana, Princess of Wales, has been killed in a car accident.
The aftermath sent shockwaves through the world and stirred suspicion. Operation Paget, a British investigation launched in 2004, would examine conspiracy theories and interview countless witnesses. But for Graham, the most telling detail wasn't hidden in classified files. It was in the atmosphere, the pressure Diana felt, the harassment she endured, the isolation despite the cameras. And it was all there in the air, in the flights they'd shared. By 1999, French investigators concluded the crash had been caused largely by Henri Paul's reckless, intoxicated driving. They cleared the paparazzi of direct criminal responsibility, citing the distance from the crash site. But in 2008, a British inquest jury reached a more haunting verdict. Diana's death was the result of grossly negligent driving by Paul and the paparazzi's pursuit. For Graham, none of this erased what he'd witnessed long before Paris: a woman increasingly cornered by fame, desperate for peace, and yet constantly chased by noise, on the ground and in the skies. He remembered how the children used to visit the cockpit, and how Diana once laughed about William, flying the plane. Those were rare moments of joy, fleeting like the clouds they soared through. But in those final months, even those clouds seemed darker. The betrayal that took flight, Diana's fears were real. Even after Diana's body had been gently placed in the hold of the aircraft and the engines began to hum over the Paris tarmac, Squadron Leader Graham Laurie couldn't stop thinking about her final months. Not just the chaos of that last night, but the disturbing undercurrent he'd sensed long before the crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. To Graham, Diana was more than the people's princess. She was a passenger who carried a visible weight, growing heavier each time she stepped aboard his aircraft. By late 1995, that weight had become impossible to ignore. In November of that year, Diana sat down with BBC journalist Martin Bashir for what would become one of the most explosive interviews in royal history. It aired on the BBC's Panorama and sent shockwaves not just through Buckingham Palace, but through the very foundations of British society. Diana didn't hold back. She spoke openly about her crumbling marriage to Prince Charles, admitting both his affair with Camilla Parker Bowles and her own with James Hewitt. But Graham, who had witnessed the increasingly distant and guarded woman Diana had become, knew this wasn't just a media bombshell. It was a cry from someone who felt utterly alone. Graham would later learn that the interview wasn't secured by honesty or trust. It was built on deceit. Bashir had reportedly used forged bank statements to convince Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, that members of Diana's inner circle were selling her out to tabloids. The forgeries falsely showed that her staff were being paid for information. To a woman already suspicious, already convinced that she was being watched and betrayed, the fake documents were a devastating blow. They confirmed her worst fears. Earl Spencer introduced Bashir to Diana, and not long after she agreed to the interview. Diana's closest friends, like Simone Simmons, would later reveal that she felt manipulated and emotionally cornered. She believed, without a doubt, that the very walls around her could not be trusted. Her phone lines were possibly tapped. Her apartments in Kensington Palace were swept for bugs. She even used secret mobile phones, ones not registered in her name, to try and keep her conversations private. These weren't the paranoid acts of a woman unraveling. They were the desperate moves of someone trying to survive in a world that had become colder and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Graham Laurie recalled that Diana never directly voiced her fears to him in the cockpit, but her silence said enough. There were more frequent last-minute flight requests, more changes in plans, more caution. She was often deep in thought, distracted, far from the lively woman who once laughed as young Prince William eagerly asked to help land the plane. She was haunted by shadows others couldn't see, shadows that seemed to follow her even into the sky. Then came her divorce in 1996. At the Queen's urging, Diana and Charles formally ended their marriage after 4 years of separation. But the cost was high. She was stripped of her title, Her Royal Highness, and lost her official royal security. To Graham, this wasn't just protocol. It was a crack in the protective shield that had once surrounded her. She was now more exposed than ever, yet still hounded relentlessly by the press. Just months later, she would die in that infamous car crash in Paris. But those close to her, including Graham, understood this hadn't started in a tunnel. It had started long before, in studios and corridors, in whispered betrayals and fake documents, in late-night sweeps for listening devices, and in quiet tears behind palace doors. Diana herself had once told her friend Roberto Dvorak that she believed she wouldn't live long, that she would die in some unnatural way, maybe in a helicopter, maybe a plane, maybe a car. Graham never forgot those words, and when he guided the aircraft carrying her coffin toward Royal Air Force Northolt on August 31, 1997, as the golden sunset bathed the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen it all coming. But what if Diana's tragic end didn't begin in a tunnel, but in shadows long before? Stay with us to uncover more. The final hours through a pilot's eyes. And still, as the engines purred steadily across the channel, Graham Laurie could not silence the thoughts circling in his mind. Diana was gone, but the confusion, the contradictions, and the questions refused to settle. Even now, years later, the deeper truth about what happened that night in Paris continued to unravel like smoke, caught in the tailwind of memory. In the gripping documentary Diana, The Ultimate Truth, former police investigator Mark Williams Thomas does something that struck a nerve with Graham. He retraced the princess's final hours in August 1997, not as myth or media frenzy, but step by step, moment by moment, breath by breath. He spoke with previously unheard witnesses and dug into expert insights that were once buried in the noise of conspiracy and speculation. Graham had always believed that something about that night felt off. Now, the voices in the documentary confirmed it. One of them was Tom Treasure, a leading cardiothoracic surgeon who had pored over the medical evidence from the crash. His findings were as painful as they were revealing. Diana, he said, had still been alive when pulled from the crumpled Mercedes. She was conscious, barely, with a racing pulse and signs of internal bleeding. Paramedics tried to stabilize her, and when one reached for his resuscitator, she moved her arm as if to help. But she never spoke. Her body was silent, but her pain was unmistakable. Treasure described a rare heart injury, a tear to the pulmonary vein, caused by the violent sideways position in which Diana had been seated. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and the way the crash unfolded meant that her injury, though severe, might have been survivable. If only emergency intervention had been faster. Graham listened to that detail more than once. Survivable. The word landed like turbulence. So many things that could have been done. So many chances missed. The documentary also reopens the debate about responsibility, a subject that never left Graham's thoughts since the moment he heard about the crash. In 2008, a British inquest ruled that the tragedy was caused by the gross negligence of both the driver, Henri Paul, and the paparazzi chasing the car. French investigators had concluded similarly back in 1999. Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz Hotel, had intoxicants and prescription medication in his system that night. But for years, theories swirled. Had his blood tests been tampered with? Was the story manipulated? Martin Montet, the lead officer in the French investigation, spoke out in the documentary, offering something Graham never expected: clarity. She confirmed that blood samples had been collected not once, but twice, immediately after the crash, and again during the autopsy. Both confirmed alcohol and antidepressants. But Montet said something even more crucial. Henri Paul wasn't drunk. Impaired, yes, but not beyond functioning. And yet even the slightest impairment, as Graham knew from flying, could spell disaster in a moment that demanded perfect judgment. Montet revealed something else that stood out. Moments before the crash, Diana's car had clipped another vehicle before entering the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. That initial impact sent it veering, scraping a curb, and finally slamming into the 13th pillar. A sequence of chaos in just seconds. It wasn't a clean narrative. It was a mess of missteps, pressure, and panic. The kind of chaos that Diana had feared for years. Even Graham, trained in protocols and precision, couldn't shake the growing sense that this crash wasn't just a tragic accident. There had been a cocktail of poor decisions, some human, some institutional. Diana had once told close friends she believed she'd die in a car crash. She feared being followed, watched, and betrayed. Now her fears echoed louder than ever in the aftermath. And in the silence of the cockpit, as Graham flew her body home across a darkened sky, he could no longer tell if her end had been fate failure, or something far more complicated? Warnings in the dark. Graham Laurie remembered Diana's silence on that final flight, but now, through whispers from the past, her voice was speaking again. Not in person, but through ink and paper, through a letter that carried the weight of fear and forewarning. And it changed everything. Revealed years later by her former butler, Paul Burrell, this handwritten note was said to be entrusted to him for safekeeping. Its contents were haunting. The letter, dated October, its exact year undisclosed, spoke of a time Diana described as the most dangerous phase of my life. In it, she voiced not just anxiety, but an unnerving clarity about what she feared would happen. According to Burrell, Diana had written of a plan, something sinister and calculated. She believed someone, whose name she deliberately left out, was preparing to sabotage her car. She mentioned brake failure, a fatal head injury. It wasn't just fear, it was almost as if she was predicting her own death. And not just any death, but one that would look like a tragic accident. The most chilling detail? She believed this accident would clear the way for Prince Charles to remarry. By the time she wrote that letter, Diana had already confided in friends about strange problems with her car. She'd grown increasingly uneasy. Her protection had been withdrawn, and not long before, her trusted bodyguard, Barry Manickey, had died in a motorcycle crash, an incident Diana once claimed might not have been an accident. Though authorities have never proven any foul play, and no direct evidence has surfaced to support the claims in the letter, its existence adds another shadow to the long tunnel of unanswered questions. For Graham, it was yet another signal that Diana hadn't simply died. She had feared this ending long before it came. But what if Diana's fears weren't just paranoia? Could her warnings, car troubles, and a bodyguard's death mean something more? Stay with us to uncover more truth. The shadows surrounding the crash. The more you peer into the final hours of Princess Diana's life, the more tangled the threads become. And now, one thread turns our gaze to the man behind the wheel that night, Henri Paul. He wasn't just any driver. Henri Paul was the acting head of security at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, a man who had worked his way up and earned the trust of high-profile guests. But after the crash on August 31st, 1997, his name became forever linked with conspiracy, whispers, and doubt. Official investigations claimed he was intoxicated when he took the wheel of the black Mercedes carrying Diana and Dodi Fayed. Yet not everyone believed that story. Not then and not now. Some argued he hadn't shown signs of being drunk just hours earlier. CCTV footage from inside the hotel seemed to show Paul walking steadily, interacting clearly. There were no slurred words, no stumbling steps. And then came more suspicions. He reportedly had large sums of money in his bank account, far more than expected for someone in his position. Was it a quiet payout? Some believed Paul might have been linked to French or even British intelligence, perhaps playing a role far deeper than chauffeur. And then, the car itself, the S280 Mercedes. Was it tampered with? Was its route changed to ensure it passed through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel that night? While official reports cleared the vehicle of any faults and found no evidence of obstruction or sabotage, the very nature of the chase, the flashing lights, the speed and the chaos left a stain of doubt. Eyewitnesses spoke of strange flashes just before the crash. Some insisted they saw bursts of light, blinding and timed too perfectly to be a coincidence. Was it just paparazzi, or was something else at play? Investigators said the flashes were unintentional. Camera flashes, headlights, streetlights. But the varied accounts from multiple vantage points left room for darker interpretations. Then came one of the most debated questions of all. Could Diana have been saved? In France, emergency responders work under a stay and stabilize system. Diana was treated for over 40 minutes at the scene before being transported to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. Critics claim that if she had been rushed directly, as UK protocol might suggest, her life could have been spared. But surgeons involved have repeatedly stated her injuries, particularly a torn pulmonary vein near her heart, were almost impossible to survive. Still, suspicion didn't start that night in Paris. It had already taken root years earlier, especially after the death of Barry Manicky, Diana's former bodyguard. In a private video recorded in 1992 and released in 2004, Diana revealed that Manicky had been the greatest love I've ever had. She suspected his 1987 motorcycle crash wasn't accidental. "I think he was bumped off," she said simply. That single sentence would echo for decades. Manicky's death, like hers, was investigated. The driver of the other vehicle involved stopped immediately, cooperated fully, and gave a statement to Operation Paget, the same inquiry that later examined Diana's own death. The findings were clear. Manicky's death was an accident, and yet the seed of doubt had been planted. Because with Diana, the truth was never simple. It was buried under layers of power, silence, and fear. But what do you think? Was Diana's crash a tragic accident or the result of something far more sinister hiding in plain sight? We'd like to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.